Okay, guys, moving to our next section, our next group of disorders. I'm going to try to hit up a couple categories, and we'll start with an incredibly common one. All right, if you remember, the anxiety disorders take up three of the top five slots in our society. So here we go. An anxiety disorder is any disorder in which distress, persistent anxiety, and fear are the key characteristics. It could also be any dysfunctional behavior that tries to reduce the anxiety. So think of someone with OCD, all right? Um, OCD sufferers can do often very bizarre, dysfunctional things to try to get that anxiety to subside, all right? One of the most popular anxiety disorders, and in fact, the most common disorder amongst us is a phobia. All right, now what I want you to remember is that a phobia isn't simply just being afraid of something. In order for it to be considered a phobia, it has to be so intense that it's paralyzing, that it causes real physiological changes. And if you ask the sufferer, it's often a very unreasonable behavior, an unreasonable symptom of a specific object or a situation. There are three common phobias, three main phobias. The first one is called a social phobia. A social phobia is like it sounds, an intense fear of a social situation or being scrutinized by others. I will share a video. I will try to share a video of a really unfortunate instance of a girl and her struggles with social phobia and the great lengths she goes to overcome it. So it's actually a very happy story, feel good story. That's social phobia, basically the fear of being in a social situation or speaking in front of a large group of people. Then there's what's known as agoraphobia. Agoraphobia, think of an agoraphobic as the opposite of a claustrophobic. Claustrophobia is the fear of tight spaces. An agoraphobe would be someone who is afraid of large open spaces. Why? Because there is this anxiety that escape could be too difficult. So a large venue like Busch Stadium or a concert hall would be completely avoided by people who are agoraphobes. This video I can share with you guys is of a woman who won't even leave her house. She's got the fear so much. So that's how bad agoraphobia can be. And then there's what gets talked about the most, and these are called specific phobias. So these would be people's irrational fears towards blood or needles, even clowns and dogs. Lots of videos of these on YouTube that I can share with you guys also if you'd like to take a look. And that's, again, what's called specific phobia. So remember, a phobia isn't a phobia until you display intense, paralyzing behaviors linked with that situation or object. The next anxiety disorder is what's called a panic disorder or a panic attack. The book calls it an anxiety tornado. Why? It shows up, it does a lot of damage, and then it just can go away. Sudden, unpredictable experiences of intense fear or anxiety, often without any known cause. So it affects about 1 in 75 people. It may only last a few minutes. What you're often likely to see in a person experiencing a panic attack are irregular heartbeats, a choking sensation, hyperventilation, trembling, and dizziness. Let me share a couple videos with you here. The one should be of a news anchor having a panic attack live on TV. A lot of times it's very subtle. You can spot the symptoms if you know what it is you're looking for. Other times you might not be able to spot it at all. All right, and that's again what's called a panic attack. Okay. Next, take a panic attack and generalize it and globalize it. You have what's called GAD. Generalized anxiety disorder is basically someone who's in a panic attack almost all the time. They can be nicknamed a neurotic, or someone who's behaving very neurotic, is just in this constant state of worry. About two-thirds of all sufferers of GAD are women. Thankfully, the syndrome seems to weaken with age. What do you see are people who are in very agitated, jittery, sleep-deprived states very often. Constant state of worries, like I said before, tension and apprehension. Basically, they go around just thinking something is either about to happen very badly or something very bad just happened, but they can't quite figure out what it is. Not healthy, okay? Without a doubt, it's important to remember that these types of anxiety disorders can lead to physical problems too, like ulcers and high blood pressure. So that's what we would call something psychosomatic, where a physical symptom and a psychological symptom are linked together. Freud calls it a free floating anxiety. an anxiety that recipients cannot always identify the cause at that time. Possible causes of generalized anxiety could be neglect during childhood. So when an anxiety occurs in childhood, the kids are not taught how to deal with it, or simply not taught life skills how to deal with failure and deal with fears, let's say. And another one. This one gets a lot of attention in our society, and that's OCD. OCD stands for obsessive compulsive disorder. All right, and I'll have a few videos to share with you here if you'd like, even an online OCD test if you want to, score your level of OCD. Yours truly would say he's got a pretty good case of it. The good news with me is I try not to let it affect my daily life. So, obsessive compulsive disorder is when you combine a disturbing thought, that's your obsession. You just can't get the thought out of your head. The irrational thought just plays over and over. And to make that thought go away, you combine it with some sort of senseless ritual. That's the compulsive behavior, whether it's checking or doing something repetitive, thinking about it over and over. That's what's called a compulsive behavior. It affects about 2 to 3% of the population. Many of these cases are undiagnosed. The onset is usually around your age to the early 20s, and it does seem to run in families. So several examples of people with OCD will be seen in these following links. If you've ever seen the movie Hoarders, not the movie, but the show Hoarders, it's now its own anxiety disorder. It used to fall under a classification of OCD as a classification of OCD. That's another example also. Okay, so enjoy these links here for further information on this anxiety disorder. Okay, our next one, our final one is, I think another one you guys are familiar with, is known as PTSD. Now, PTSD used to be linked with just war veterans, okay, guys who experienced trauma during some sort of war event. And as a result of it, they're left in these high anxiety states. It's not just war anymore. It's any haunting memory, paranoia, nightmare, social withdrawal, jumping anxiety, emotional detachment, insomnia, and or violent behavior that lingers for 4 or more weeks following a traumatic event. That traumatic event could be surviving a tsunami, could be witnessing something very, very horrific like a car crash or being molested or raped. All of those could fall under PTSD causes. It, without a doubt, does have a link to war, and it still does. If you guys have access, try to do a search for War Torn. It's a really nice documentary that HBO produced on just how bad what they used to call shell shock runs in the lives of these Army veterans, these soldiers. Okay, you can see there is a pretty strong statistic there for survivors or just people who were in very close proximity to the events of September 11th. 10 to 20% of those individuals diagnosed with some form of PTSD. Okay, and then down there at the end, you can see there's also what's known as post-traumatic growth. This is a pretty interesting effect that can happen in some people. Some people who survive or witness a traumatic event, they don't suffer stress as a result. They use it as almost a massive wake-up call and how lucky they are to be alive. And so they see it as more a post-traumatic growth period where they um, start to give their time to a charitable organization or become a more spiritual person because of how blessed they are to come out of that traumatic event with little to no harm. So that's what's known as post-traumatic growth. All right. Special slide here for you guys. Reported diagnoses of post-traumatic stress and then links to violent behavior. We've got Eddie Ray Routh on the right, if you've ever seen the movie American Sniper. Okay, you can definitely see that there's a connection between a violent act and being diagnosed PTSD with his killing of Chris Kyle. And then Nadal Hassan killed 13 people at Fort Hood. He was the military psychologist on that base in Fort Hood, and diagnosed PTSD prior to being stationed at Fort Hood as a result of his deployment in Iraq. So went on a shooting spree very sad in Fort Hood, Texas. Okay. All right, let's try to explain these. The explanation of anxiety disorders, one of the best explanations, especially when it comes to phobias, is classical and operant conditioning. All right, so remember back to, uh, you know, the being attacked can be considered an unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is pain, and then you link that attack to what did the attacking, the dog. Okay, and so people can form a generalization of being attacked by a dog to then fearing all dogs. All right. There's also observational learning that there is a belief that just simply being in proximity to someone else who has a fear, like a mother and child, I you know, wonder a lot of times if being around a mother who is a germaphobe, could her children, even though it might not be linked genetically, could their children become germaphobes simply by being around their mother who's constantly in that state of anxiety of coming down with some sort of germ-related illness? With that said, there is some evidence that supports heredity plays a role in anxiety disorders, as was found in the 80s and 90s that identical twins raised separately, all right, so we're genetic copies of each other, still coming down with the same phobia. Very strong evidence that anxiety disorders can be um, hereditary. And then finally, staying in line with biological evidence, you've got um, higher activity in a particular region of the brain of sufferers with OCD known as the anterior cingulate cortex. All right, this is an area of our brain that is known to monitor our actions and check for errors. It's our check center in our brain, and in people with OCD, that region is a little more active, a little bit more haywire, causing us to overcheck and overly self-monitor. All right, therefore leading to possible cases of obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, so there's the anxiety disorders. All right, next we'll visit some other categories.